What I wanted to talk about today is my training was in Boston, and I like Boston. I think Boston's a great city. More specifically, I was in Cambridge. So much history there. There's Walden Pond is over there, and Thoreau's one of my favorite writers, I think, of all time. I think his work, Walden, it's one of my favorite pieces of writing that I've ever personally encountered. And I think it's a piece of writing that really had a profound effect on me because I read it when I was quite young. I read it when I think I was 16 or 17, and it sort of changed the way that I viewed literature, and I viewed more classical texts. And not to say, he's definitely, it's not some crazy old writing, it's not like reading, Raphael or Plato or these older guys, but Walden really changed the way that I look at things, and that actually got me a few years later into reading Emerson. And I picked this up when I was in Boston at the Harvard Library. I wanted to get a work from a New English author, a New English thinker, while I was in New England. And so I got this, and this is, I had Emerson's works before, but sort of like piecemeal. This is a pretty comprehensive collection. I don't know if you guys can see this. It's called Ralph Waldo Emerson Selected Essays, Lectures, and Poems. And it has all the heavy hitters are in here. You have the American Scholar, you have nature and all the parts of nature. You have the poet, which is a really good one. You have experience in here, self-reliance. You have all his, a few of his poems. You have the Concord hymns, you have Brahma, the Sphinx, Uriel. But I guess what I wanted to talk about today is, I just think Emerson is such an important guy to read, especially if you're a young man. I feel like Emerson might be my favorite writer, just because the themes that he discusses, a few that we'll go into in this video, I just think are so important, especially for maybe not young men, but just young people in general, to think about. Emerson, one of his best pieces of writing comes in the American Scholar, which is an address he gives, I believe, in 1847, something like that. He's addressing a university. It's a commencement speech, and Emerson says something in there. It's where that really famous quote comes from. Within you slumbers the whole of reason, which is one of my favorite quotes of all time. But he touches on this idea that as a young man, as a young woman, we often dismiss ideas that we might have, and he talks about this in Experience, another essay, or Self-Reliance. I think I'm getting them mixed up now, but we often dismiss ideas because they come from us, and we think, I'm just a young guy, I'm just a young girl, what do I know? We often read these old works from these, super famous authors, guys like Plato, Aristotle, Thoreau, and I'm guilty of this. I mean, it's almost hypocritical in a way because, Emerson tells you to sort of dismiss those that came before you, but you have to read Emerson to sort of discover that idea. At least nowadays you do, because he's not around anymore, obviously. But he basically says that don't dismiss ideas that come from you just because they did just that. Don't think that someone's ideas or someone's conception of the world or their values or their reasoning or their logic is more important or carries more weight than yours just because they lived before you, or just because they're taught in universities. And I think just that, if you take nothing else from Emerson's essays, just the notion that you are every bit of the thinker that the Greeks were, that the Renaissance writers were, that the American Enlightenment writers were, that you have just as much weight to sort of go out and reason and sort of grapple with the world and come to your own conclusions. I think it's so powerful, and it really lights the spark, at least for me, it lights a spark where I think, I've been so guilty of this, where, I think all of us have had, these good ideas for a book or a short story or a poem or something, you're walking around, I've been walking around Cleveland, and there's things that hit you that you want to put down on paper that you think are important, that people should sort of, people should think about. But because they're coming from your own mind, your own intellect, you think, oh, it couldn't be that important because who am I? I'm not a trained philosopher. I'm not a trained thinker. I don't have peer-reviewed papers. I'm not published. I'm not on the Amazon or New York Times best-selling list. So who am I? But when you turn that notion on its head, and when you think that, no, I am, and these sort of superficial determinants that you're important, or that you have reason, or that you are, someone worth listening to, they are just that. They are just superficial, and they are just, other men or other women assigning value to your thoughts. When you sort of dismiss that and say, no, I'm the only one that can assign value to a thought, and therefore my thoughts are just as worthy as the thoughts of any other man that came before me or after me, or is living side by side with me, it really does empower you. And I think I think if you had to read one Emerson essay, I would say read The American Scholar, because it frames what being a scholar really means in such a new light. I mean, not new, this is right, mid 1800s, 19th century. But it frames it in such an unorthodox light. Usually if I were to say, think of a scholar, you sort of think of this guy in like an armchair, sort of like this, right? You think of this guy in like this, like a leather armchair with a pipe by a fireplace, and he's researching at a big university, and or you think a scholar, he's someone tucked away in the library, and he's just working day in and day out. But Emerson says that the scholar is someone that, he has this great quote. He says, "Why would you read the words of other men when you can read God directly?" When you walk around outside and you see the birds, and you see the trees, and you see the seasons change, and you see all of these miracles that God has sort of placed right in front of you, you, as a human, you get this raw sort of understanding, and it's incommunicable, it's indescribable, it's something that you don't need to, there's no sort of metrics that you can apply to it, there's no sort of quantitative reasoning to understand, the beauty of experience and of life. But God communicates with all of us, if you're listening, Emerson says in nature, he says, a beautiful soul, nature is a reflection of your own soul. And so if your soul is beautiful, when you look out, you see beauty in everything. And, vice versa. If your soul is tainted, or if you haven't done enough work on yourself, you're not going to see the beauty in creation, and in the world around you. And just small instances of just before I started making this, I grabbed an iced coffee, take a sip. I went to grab a coffee, and just the interaction with the guy behind the counter, it's something so simple and so mundane. I think all too often we're so quick to dismiss those sorts of encounters in the day-to-day. It's just sort of like it's that inner robot that we have. But when you think about how beautiful that is, that I could have a conversation with someone, that I could check in, see how their day's going, even if it is superficial. How's your day going? Oh, pretty good. How's yours? Yeah, pretty good. Can't complain. Just the fact that you can have that interaction with someone is beautiful. The fact that, when I was walking here, it's a little bit hot today in Cleveland, I felt the little beads of sweat rolling down my back, because I'm wearing 2 layers, and I felt the sweat rolling down my back, and I thought, how odd is that I can feel my back, right? And I know we're going into some sort of loopy territory here, but everything is sort of incredible when you think about it, when you really, think about how your hands work. How crazy is that? There's a video I want to make, actually, I'll talk about it a little bit now, but there's a video I want to make on, there's this great book called The Holographic Universe. And it's this sort of like I'd say it's a scientific theory that came around in the early 1900s, and it was built upon by generations of scientific researchers, where they sort of describe experience, right, and what it really means to experience the world. And it has really strong connections with a lot of theological views on how, it isn't incredible that we experience anything. I believe that we do have souls, and that we are sort of souls trapped within vessels. And, there's a great part in that book, which we'll talk about in the next video, but he says, you think that you see something in 3D space, right? So if I'm looking, right now I'm looking towards the bathroom, right? And I can see that, the sink is about, let's say, 3 meters from where I'm sitting. In actuality, the sink is on the surface of my eye. It's the photons are reflecting from the sink, and they're on the surface of my eye, but my brain has translated the depth, that there's some distance. And if you understand that translation is constantly running, when you sort of think about it, there is no such thing as depth. There's no such thing as space. Everything is immediate. Everything is now. But it's our instant translation of those things within our brain that lets our soul, through our body, sort of experience things like depth and the passage of time, and brightness and darkness and things like that. So that's interesting. Not the topic of today's video, but something I want to talk about later. Emerson is just so important, and I think it's so important especially if you're new to older literature, and if you're new to, if you're someone that reads more, I guess, lighter works, things like, mystery novels, or not to say that those are always light, they can sometimes have very profound, deep themes and lessons within those books. I mean, look at like something like Crime and Punishment, right? But if you're someone that reads a lot of contemporary work, and you've sort of been on the edge of whether or not you want to dip into older writings and more classical texts, I tried to get one of my friends. He is getting into reading now, but the first thing I would say is to look at Emerson, look at Thoreau, look at the American Enlightenment movement and transcendentalism specifically, because there's such gems, and there's such important lessons put in such simple terms, and they also apply so universally. If you were to read this book today, if you were to read American Scholar today, or if you were to read it 50 years ago, or I think in 50 years, it holds true. The sentiments hold true. And it's very much, they're works that sort of speak to this inner identity that I think we all know that we have, but we're often too shy to encounter, or we're too shy to sort of converse with, or, we're quick to tell to shut up, But I think if you can listen to that inside voice you have sometimes when you're walking around, if you're sitting in bed alone and you're reading, or maybe you're just looking at a sunset, that there's something more. But it's often hard, especially if you're uncomfortable having those talks. I think it's often, at least in my case, it's often because I lack the framing, I lack the vocabulary, I lack the framework from which to sort of observe those aspects of myself. And I think Emerson and Thoreau, if you read them properly and you take your time with them, and they're not long works. I mean, American Scholar is maybe a 1-hour read. If you take your time with those things, I think it frames it builds such beautiful scaffolding from which you can go out and then start crafting your own philosophy and your own thoughts and your own ideas about things. And, there's this thing, I don't want to make this video too heavy, but there's this feeling you get sometimes. It's funny, I feel like I read quite a lot. I think all the people that I've met that read a lot, you sort of usually have this sort of temperament or this inclination to be a little bit more to yourself, and to feel like, if you look at the stats nowadays, no one's reading, right? People aren't reading. People are doing, maybe someone will do an audiobook now and then, but everything's so fast. Everything's, 5-second TikTok videos, 10-second YouTube shorts, a podcast, Netflix shows. Everything's so quick, and it's the majority of people are consuming this quick sort of like mental popcorn. But I think if you read, you sometimes feel like, not so much an outsider, but you do sometimes feel a little bit detached from most people on the street, right? If you were to go to your office and say, I'll start a book club, I'm not sure you'll get too many takers. Besides the point I'm trying to make is, Emerson says that, when you're a very introspective person, and when you really try and look for the beauty in things, and and I mean this in the least cliche, sort of least fluffy way, but when you are trying to be like a real romantic and really be in love with existence and with what God has made for you and what it means to be a human, when you really fall in love with what it means to experience life and to have life sort of run through you, more often than not, you're going to feel, and I felt this way many times. I mean, let me know in the comments, guys, if you guys know what I'm getting at here, but more often than not, you will feel sort of, not alone, but you will feel sort of lonely, a little bit isolated, a little bit like you might not be part of the larger crowd, which isn't a bad thing. I don't think it's ever a bad thing to sort of stand out. I think a lot of good things come from standing out, but that was a rough one. A lot of good things come from standing out, but Emerson sort of, I relate to him in that sense where he says, and not to say that, I'm not equating, or maybe I should, right? He says we should equate. I'm not saying I am just like Emerson, but I do know what he means when he says that he feels sort of lonely and he feels sort of like different from most, and that not in a pick-me way, not in a I'm so different than everyone else, but you do sort of feel a little bit like your own island, and like everyone else is on the mainland, and you're sort of on your own island, and you're trying to figure out what life is for you. And I remember when I read that, it sort of it struck me a bit, and I said, I do know what this guy means, and I do know how he felt, and it's crazy that me and this guy from, what is it now, 120 years ago, are going through the same emotions. And I mean, Emerson's young when he's writing this as well. I'm a young guy, so I sort of know what he's getting at. Which is beautiful work. Beautiful work. I took a few notes. I don't want this video to go on too long, but I will end with a few quotes. And let me know if you guys like this this is, I guess, like an intro to who Emerson is, and I guess an intro to his work. But I will do so many more videos on Emerson and Thoreau, and I started reading this new sci-fi book from Philip K. Dick. It's my first Philip K. Dick book, so I'll do a video on that hopefully by the time I'm in California. But let's find something good here. He says, this is a good one. He says, so this is in The Poet. For as it is dislocation and detachment from the life of God that makes things ugly, the poet who reattaches things to nature in the whole, reattaching even artificial things and violations of nature to nature by a deeper insight, disposes very easily of the most disagreeable facts. Dude, all his quotes are like that, man. This guy is just so hard. But I thought that was true. And I know exactly what he means when, anytime you see something sort of ugly, and anytime you see sort of something that rubs you the wrong way, it is sort of something that is departed from this light, right? This goodness, the positive sort of energy of creation, right? And at the same time, if you make peace with the fact that, ugly exists so that things can be beautiful, you're not as disgusted by them. You sort of understand that everything has its place, and righteousness only exists because of sin, and light is only there because of the dark, and just really good. And he just puts things in such a beautiful way. I think when you read Emerson, it's such a unique mix of poetry and prose, because you are reading prose, but almost every line has such a poetic sense of weight, you know? Let's see, what did he say here? This was great. He's talking about, this is the thing we said, where if your soul is pure, you see other things as being pure because they're reflections of your soul. He says that the same is true of the body, right? He quotes this guy, Spencer. He quotes a poem by Spencer, and he says, "For soul is form, and doth the body make." Your body's, and how true is this, right? When have you, I mean, I've seen people where, you know, when a person just, you can tell a person just sort of looks mean, and then you come to find out that they are mean. Not that this is always the case, but then you find out that they are just a nasty person. They do just have a bad soul within them, and it's sort of emanating from their skin. You know, someone's face just looks, you know, like they mean ill, like they have ill intent, and usually they do have ill intent. Not always, not always. He says the universe is the externization of the soul. That's a good one. I'll end with this. So the poet, this essay, he's talking about the importance of being poetical and being, and what use the poet has, because often we think of the poet as someone, you know, writing odes or, constantly running from one woman to another in like this sort of hedonistic, romantic way. But he says the true poet is someone that sees the beauty in life and existence and can capture verses from God. And it's so beautiful. He sort of phrases it in this way where all of creation is this great song. It's this great poem. And anytime that we produce poetry, we're sort of grasping at this underpinning or this underlying narrative that God has created for us. And then we try to put it in our own words, and he says often we can misspeak, and that's when, you know, we have, you know, either good poets or bad poets. It's whether or not they can, it's their sort of proficiency or their ability to grasp at that, the beauty of creation and that underlying sort of ode to life. So I'll end with this. This is one of my favorite quotes by Emerson. He says, "For poetry was all written before time was, and whenever we are so finely organized that we can penetrate into that region where the air is music, we hear those primal warblings and attempt to write them down, but we lose ever and anon a word or a verse and substitute something of our own, and thus miswrite the poem." God, that's the sort of stuff you'll read with Emerson. I'll let you guys ruminate on that. I'll let you think a little bit. Beautiful work. If you guys haven't read Emerson, please do. This is my notebook. I carry everything in here, daily notes, everything. I have a lot of video ideas in here. I have been lazy, but I promise I will try better, and I will try harder to post more often. Thank you guys so much. This is my second video ever on the channel. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with this channel, but I hope you guys enjoyed. And hopefully I'll speak to you guys soon.